You might think that being royalty in the past meant living an amazing life with golden palaces and endless power. But if you woke up tomorrow as a woman in the Ottoman Sultan's harem, there's a high chance you wouldn't live past 30. Inside those golden palace walls, 400 women lived in a prison made of silk. Something as simple as your monthly period could get you killed. If you got pregnant without permission, you could be sewn alive into leather and thrown into the sea. After every intimate encounter, 12 eunuchs would decide if you were worthy to keep your womb. This is the dark history that many people don't want to talk about. The hidden truth behind beauty and power where the screams of women are buried. I'm about to take you into the Ottoman Empire's most terrifying place, the imperial harem at Topkapi Palace. This isn't the version you see in movies, with belly dancers and sweet treats. This is the truth, a system of mass killing disguised as luxury living. For 500 years, the Ottoman Empire created a system so twisted that even European ambassadors, who thought burning witches was normal, were shocked by what they saw. But most people don't realize that this wasn't random cruelty. It was a carefully planned system. There was paperwork for every death, every execution, and every broken woman. The Ottoman Empire wants you to forget about this part of their history. They want you to remember the beautiful buildings, military victories, and cultural achievements. They don't want you to know about the silver tray that decided women's fates, or the basements where children's lives ended, or the Bosphorus Strait that became a mass grave. So get ready. In the next hour, I'm going to show you 7 parts of this palace of nightmares that will make you appreciate every boring day of your modern life. By the end, you'll never see a history textbook the same way again. Let's start with the nightly horror that made 400 women wish they'd be forgotten. Every night, as the sun set over Istanbul, a ritual began that turned the palace into a gambling den where women's lives were the stakes. Imagine this: 400 women, ranging from 13 to 25 years old, sitting in the most luxurious prison ever built, waiting to see if tonight they would be chosen for something that could either make them powerful or send them to their death. The selection process was simple but horrifying. A silver tray was placed in the Sultan's private chambers with pieces of paper bearing the women's names. The Sultan didn't even choose. That would be too much responsibility. Instead, the eunuchs would make the selection. It was a lottery, but winning could mean losing your life. And the worst part? The women had to act grateful. Any sign of fear, hesitation, or being physically unclean meant immediate punishment. You won't learn this in school, but these women lived in constant fear of their own bodies. Here's how one night of selection went. Based on palace records from 1640, the chief eunuch, Sumbul Aga, entered the harem at 8 p.m. The women were lined up like products in a store, and the silver tray was carried by 2 junior eunuchs, while guards cleared the way. The trip from the Sultan's chambers to the harem took exactly 12 minutes. On November 15th, 1640, a woman named Ai was selected. She was 17 years old and had been in the harem for 3 years. When the eunuchs came to collect her, they found out she was on her period. The official record says she died from sudden illness, but the truth was that she was punished for something beyond her control. But the selection was just the start. If a woman was chosen and deemed fit, she would be taken to the preparation chambers, where 12 eunuch-trained medical inspectors would examine her. They would ask one question: should the seed be preserved? This was not poetry. It was a cold, clinical question to decide if a woman should keep her ability to have children. If the answer was no, she would be removed. If yes, she would be sent to the Sultan's chambers, knowing that any failure to conceive would mean being chosen again. The stats are chilling. Out of 400 women, only 10 would ever have children. The rest lived in a constant state of waiting, knowing that being forgotten was the best thing they could hope for. Here's what your textbooks won't tell you. If a woman was chosen multiple times but never became pregnant, she was considered a problem. Records show that in 1652, 23 women were moved in one night. The official records said they were reassigned, but witness accounts say they were sent to the Bosphorus Strait, where they disappeared forever. The psychological abuse was also planned. Dr. Fatma Göçek, a historian, uncovered records showing that this randomness was designed to keep the women just hopeful enough to avoid despair, but not enough to feel safe. It was a form of psychological warfare. And here's the worst part. The women were turned against each other. Instead of uniting against their captors, they competed. They exposed each other's biological schedules, sabotaged rivals, and even celebrated when someone was removed. The system turned victims into accomplices. In 1675, a French ambassador wrote that women in the harem were so scared of the silver tray that many would drink potions to make themselves infertile, choosing permanent barrenness over the uncertainty of being selected. Now, let's talk about the economics behind this horror. Each woman was a huge investment. They were bought, trained, clothed, and fed. The Ottoman Empire spent the equivalent of $2 million in today's money every year just to maintain them. But they considered it worth it because the system served multiple purposes, ensuring pure bloodlines, preventing political alliances through marriage, and controlling succession. The religious justifications made it even worse. Islamic law was twisted to support this system. Biological functions like pregnancy outside of selection were considered theft from the Sultan, as if women's bodies were state property. Historians are just starting to uncover the full extent of this system. Digital analysis of palace records shows that selection wasn't random. Women from certain regions were picked more often. Girls aged 16 to 18 were preferred, and those who showed intelligence or education were ignored. The Sultan wanted bodies, not brains. Modern dating apps seem easy in comparison. Today we swipe left or right, but back then, a simple swipe of the pen could mean life or death. But here's where it gets truly crazy. One 15-year-old girl didn't just survive this system, she conquered it. Her name was Alexandra Lisovska, but history remembers her as Roxelana or Harem Sultan. At just 15, she was taken from her family by raiders and sold as a slave in Istanbul. But instead of being broken by the system, she mastered it. She became a master manipulator, using everything she learned to rise to power and become one of the most powerful women in history. Her story is dark, but it shows how sometimes, to survive in hell, you have to become a monster yourself. Roxelana didn't just adapt, she turned the system that enslaved her into her stepping stone to power. She studied Sultan Suleiman, memorized his routines, and became his equal. She played psychological games with him, using tactics that modern psychologists would study centuries later. In 1524, she created a crisis in the palace to save Suleiman's favorite manuscript, risking her life to become a hero. She didn't just survive, she thrived, manipulating her way to the top. By 1534, Roxelana convinced Suleiman to break centuries of tradition and marry her. But her rise didn't stop there. She had 6 children with him, but that wasn't enough. She had Suleiman's son, Prince Mustafa, killed after 3 years of planning. She didn't use poison. She used rumors and lies to turn Suleiman against his own son. In 1553, Mustafa was strangled on false charges, and Roxelana watched it happen, showing no emotion. She had become exactly what the system created, a survivor without a conscience. Roxelana's legacy is controversial. Some see her as a feminist icon, but she was also a war criminal. In a system that demanded brutality, she became a monster to survive. She broke gender barriers by becoming a political advisor, architectural patron, and diplomatic representative. However, her journey was stained with blood as she was responsible for the deaths of at least 40 people, including children who were a threat to her sons. Today, we call it Stockholm Syndrome, but for her, it was just another day. Every morning, she woke up next to the man who owned her in the palace where she was imprisoned. She wore jewels bought from the slave trade and smiled. She wrote love poems to him. She bore him children while planning murders with her other hand. To survive, people often pay with their soul, and she paid the full price. She died in 1558, becoming the only woman in Ottoman history to be buried next to a sultan. She defeated the system by becoming worse than the system itself. From a Ukrainian priest's daughter to a slave, a sultana, and a killer, she forged the ultimate survivor. Her last letter to the sultan, written on her deathbed, might be the most chilling document in Ottoman history. My sultan, I go ahead to prepare paradise for your arrival. Every decision I made was for our dynasty. History will remember our love. Let them forget the rest. She knew exactly what she had done, and she felt no remorse. Because in a palace where 397 out of 400 women died forgotten, she chose to live as a monster rather than die as a victim. But she was the exception. Most women faced a different fate. They couldn't manipulate their way to power or murder their way to safety. For them, the palace had other plans, methods of disposal that were so civilized, they made medieval torture look honest. The Ottoman palace turned into a factory of creative murder, and I use the word creative because these weren't standard executions. No public beheadings or hangings here. The Ottomans had a problem. They needed to kill women regularly, but Islamic law forbade spilling royal blood, and religious sensibilities demanded clean deaths. So they came up with an innovative method. They turned murder into an art form, where the canvas was human suffering and the paint was silk and seawater. The palace employed professional stranglers. This was their actual job title, Bostanshire gardeners. But instead of pruning roses, they pruned the Sultan's human garden. These men were chosen for their discretion, trained in anatomy, and practiced on animals until they could perform their duties in under 30 seconds. Your natural bodily functions could sign your death warrant. Imagine living every day knowing that a biological process you couldn't control might trigger your execution. Silk strangulation wasn't random torture. It was specifically chosen because it left no marks, spilled no blood, and could be done quickly and quietly. The clean death for the unclean woman. The Bostanshire used a specific technique passed down through generations. 3 feet of silk cord twisted 7 times for strength. One man would hold the victim's shoulders while another performed the act. The whole process was so standardized they had quality control. If it took longer than 45 seconds, the executioner would be punished for causing unnecessary suffering. But here's what the textbooks leave out. The psychological torture came before the physical act. Women marked for strangulation weren't killed immediately. They were told at sunset and executed at sunrise, giving them 1 night to prepare their souls. Palace records show most spent these hours writing letters that would never be sent to families they would never see again. The sea punishment was another form of execution. Women who became pregnant without permission faced this fate. They would be sewn into leather sacks along with several cats. The cats weren't there for company. They were there to create movement and panic, ensuring the woman couldn't hold her breath or float. The execution squad had a specific boat for this purpose, painted black and used only on moonless nights. They would row to a predetermined spot in the Bosphorus, where the currents would sweep the bodies into the Black Sea. This was considered merciful compared to what Christian kingdoms did to adulteresses. The Ottomans actually thought they were being progressive. From 1520 to 1680, Ottoman records show at least 3,000 women met their end in the Bosphorus. That's 18 women per year, every year for 160 years. The strait became such a common dumping ground that local fishermen developed superstitions about certain areas. They called them mermaid graveyards and refused to fish there. But not all disposals were violent. Sometimes the cruelest death was no death at all. Banishment to the Eskisaray, the old palace, was a psychological execution. Women past their prime or who committed minor infractions were sent to this decaying building on the outskirts of Istanbul. No visitors, no letters, no hope, just hundreds of discarded women waiting to die. A French diplomat who visited in 1670 described it as a marble tomb filled with living ghosts. Women who entered young emerged as corpses, if they emerged at all. The silence was so complete you could hear hearts breaking. The women there developed their own sign language because speaking was discouraged. They created an entire culture of the condemned. The Ottoman Empire's methods of execution were not only skilled, but also organized and systematic. Each method had its own cost. For example, a strangulation execution cost 3 aksa, equivalent to the price of a good meal. If someone was sentenced to drowning, the cost was 20 aksa, which included boat rental and crew wages. Exile, on the other hand, had no financial cost except for the one-time transport fee. The empire kept detailed records of the execution methods. This meant every execution was accounted for. The date, time, method, and a special evaluation called satisfaction rating were recorded. In a way, every execution had a standard. How quickly, quietly, and without leaving any marks it should be done. A good execution was quick, silent, and left no evidence. The bureaucracy involved in keeping these records was so complex that the executioners themselves received special training. Many of them developed mental health issues as they had become part of the killing process. A strangler's journal, discovered in 1987, revealed that these executioners struggled with psychological problems, and the journal contained 400 pages of apologies to the victims. These executions also had religious justification. Scholars in the empire issued fatwas declaring that women who disrupted the system should be removed. They argued that these executions were not only permissible, but necessary for the safety of the empire. They used religious texts to authorize the killings, turning holy scriptures into execution orders. The most terrifying method of execution was reserved for women who attempted to escape. They were subjected to tash suzu, or the stone punishment, where they were sealed alive inside palace walls. In 2010, during renovations at Topkapi Palace, human remains were found inside several walls, confirming what had long been rumored. These women were literally erased from existence, becoming part of the structure that imprisoned them. This punishment was so cruel that it makes medieval European executions seem merciful. At least those executions were public spectacles with some twisted sense of justice. These executions were private erasures, industrial-scale disappearances that left no martyrs. No stories and no warnings for others, just empty beds and new people to fill them. When poisoning methods were introduced, they varied based on the women's status. High-status women, who had borne children or held titles, were not subjected to strangulation, but were given a special sherbet, which tasted like almonds and worked within hours. The palace had a chief poisoner who maintained a garden of toxic plants and tested new formulas on condemned criminals. All of this was so complicated and brutal that it crossed any boundaries of human decency. The Sultan adopted these methods to maintain control and power in the empire. The killings were all about maintaining the empire's security and strength. The empire didn't just rely on capturing slaves, it ran a whole business based on people. This was like the modern-day human trafficking network, but the Ottomans made it an official state policy. The devshirme system was introduced, which involved kidnapping children and turning them into slaves. This system was so thorough and organized that modern traffickers would envy their efficiency. When Ottoman officials went to European Christian territories to collect children, it was like they were shopping for livestock. Children's height, weight, physical condition, and even intelligence were inspected. The process was so organized that buying and selling children became as normal as buying livestock. The fear in every family was that their child would never return. These children had no future, and the empire's only goal was to increase its power using them. The selected children were completely under the empire's control, and their journey began. This process was all part of a government-run system where every child was marked and then transported through a death march to Istanbul. Many of the children died along the way, but this didn't concern the empire, as it considered it natural selection. Through this system, the Ottoman Empire used the lives of children to increase its power. The system was so brutal that there was no mercy, no justice, just ruthless control over human lives. Under the Ottoman Empire, children were not only used to increase the power of the empire, but were part of a complete system where humans were abducted for a specific purpose, and their lives were completely changed. Every child involved lost their identity as part of a carefully planned process. This system was not just about increasing the empire's power, but also about shaping the body and soul of these children. According to the empire's will, the Ottoman devshirme system was a process where children from Christian regions were kidnapped and used for various purposes within the empire. These children were not only physically changed, but their mentality was also completely transformed. These children were selected in such a specific way that they seemed like objects rather than humans, chosen with great precision. The whole system was so organized and cold-hearted that as long as it remained successful, the empire considered it a successful strategy. It worked because every child's life served some purpose, whether as a soldier, agent, or in some other capacity to serve the empire. These children were not only given military training, but were also mentally conditioned to follow orders without question. Their mindset was shaped in a way that they would even consider their parents as enemies and be willing to sacrifice their lives for the empire. This process deeply changed the children's personalities, making them willing to go to any lengths for their new purpose. The transformation was so complete that these children carried the effects of it throughout their lives. Their goal became to serve the empire, and they carried out their duties without caring for any human feelings. The system was such that children who were once familiar with family, life and love were slowly moved towards a completely different mindset and life. They were given mental training that not only made them weak individually, but also fully aligned them with the empire's interests. This was the harsh reality of the devshirme system. The selection of children, their mindset transformation, and guiding their lives in a direction where human relationships, love, or connections were completely erased, was a brutal strategy. It wasn't just a way to gain power for the empire, but part of a whole system designed to treat humans as objects and erase their identity. In the Ottoman Empire, The treatment of children and women was part of a system where they were not only physically changed, but their minds were completely reshaped. Under this system, women and children were used solely for the benefit of the empire, and their lives were shaped for a specific purpose. This process was carried out as a strategy, where these individuals were subjected to so much mental torture that they became willing to dedicate their lives to the empire's orders. In the palace, children faced specific punishments. One of these was the marble treatment, where children were made to stand naked on cold marble for hours. There was a silent room, where they were kept in isolation to deprive them of their senses. There was also a room called the memory room, where boys were lowered into darkness and left with just enough food to survive. Despite all this, European ambassadors condemned the system but were still participants in it. The system produced three types of graduates. Some became janissaries, or part of the administration, turning their mental pain into fanatic loyalty. Some boys were physically altered to serve in the harem. The third group, the broken ones, were quietly removed when they became too damaged to function. What most people don't realize is that this system created the most effective administrators of the Ottoman Empire. Grand viziers, military commanders, and provincial governors, many of them were graduates of the palace schools. Their shared trauma bonded them in a way that made them protect each other and the system that made them. The effectiveness of this training led other powers to try to replicate it. The Safavid Persians built similar schools, and the Mughal Indians imported Ottoman teachers. This system spread because it worked. If working means creating completely loyal and utterly broken servants. A survivor's account from 1701, after escaping to Venice, provides rare insight. They took my name, my faith, my innocence. They gave me knowledge, power, and nightmares that last a lifetime. I speak 7 languages, but scream in my mother tongue. I command thousands, but cannot command the memories to stop. His testimony puts modern educational complaints into perspective. We worry about standardized testing and homework loads. They worried about surviving until morning. The palace school finally closed in 1909 during the Young Turk Revolution. Today, the building is part of the Topkapi Palace Museum. Tourists walk through the halls where children were broken, admiring the architecture that was built on suffering. The guidebooks mention the excellent education provided, but they don't mention the cost. The empire kept detailed records, not only of financial accounts and population counts, but also of deaths. These records show that the whole system was designed for industrial-scale femicide and systematic child abuse. The numbers don't lie. From 1520 to 1680, only 3 out of 400 women in the harem lived to old age. The rest simply vanished into historical silence, becoming statistical ghosts. In each harem, there were 300 to 400 women. The average stay was 4.7 years, not because women were released or married, but because they died or disappeared. Each year, 80 to 100 new women were needed to maintain the numbers. Their selection was done with great care. These women became part of a horrifying system where their only purpose in life was to serve the empire. The palace's spending records show that each year, 3,000 gold coins were spent to move these women, but their purpose was always to serve the empire. The death records show that 2,238 women died, many due to sudden illness, depression, or accidents. This entire system was so effective that the empire invested in it and ran it like a formal administrative system. Everything was done with precision, and these women were given only one purpose in life: to serve the empire. All of this was done at the cost of human rights and for the benefit of the empire. There are protests at academic conferences about Ottoman slavery because the truth is being seen as an attack. However, the evidence is too overwhelming to hide. The digitization of Ottoman archives has brought to light documents that were once inaccessible to researchers. Every year, new evidence emerges showing the extent of human trade and orders for the execution of women. These countless documents testify to the existence of a complete bureaucracy for human disposal. Among these documents are orders for the execution of pregnant women and budget allocations for disposing of human remains. This truth feels very different in our modern world. Every wedding photo at Topkapi Palace is not just a work of art, but represents a terrifying truth built on bones. Every tile admired in Ottoman architecture was cleaned of blood, and the gardens where tourists take photos were fertilized with human remains. This beauty was built on cruelty. Some argue that we shouldn't judge history by modern standards. They say slavery was normal then, and that every empire did terrible things. But this argument overlooks the scale and systematization of what happened. The Ottomans didn't just own slaves, they turned human disposal into an industrial process. They didn't just exploit women, they turned the killing of women into a bureaucratic practice. The harem system serves as a warning for today, because it shows how cruelty can be hidden behind tradition, how religion can justify brutality, and how economic interests can outweigh human rights. What does this 500-year history teach us? The answer lies in the dark truths of humanity, and shows how we forget the suffering that doesn't fit our preferred narratives. We started with a simple statistic. 400 women enter and only 3 survive. Now you can understand the human reality behind these numbers. The silver tray that selected victims, the silk cords that strangled them, the leather sacks that drowned them, the palace walls that buried them. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a systematic practice of femicide that was perfected over 500 years. The Ottoman Empire created a machine that consumed humans with bureaucratic efficiency. This cruelty was carried out by a system where each killing had a budget line, execution standards and performance reviews for killers. This system was organized in such a way that a human death was considered an administrative process. But what is hidden in this system is that the cruelty wasn't carried out by monsters. The men who strangled women went back home to their families. The eunuchs who selected victims for death were themselves victims of mutilation. The women who enforced the harem rules were survivors who became perpetrators of cruelty. Ordinary people carried out extraordinary cruelty because the system demanded it. Luxury and cruelty were not separate, they were interconnected. The same silk that made beautiful clothes became nooses. The same marble that created architectural wonders was used to hide bodies. The same education that produced brilliant administrators created broken children. The same gardens that tourists photograph today were fertilized with human remains. Beauty and cruelty were not opposites, they were partners. Now, let me bring it all together with the silver tray. This simple object, which could be displayed in any museum, carried names that decided life or death. Women lived in fear of its appearance for years. Some poisoned themselves to avoid being selected. Others prayed to be chosen, thinking that power meant safety. Both groups were wrong. This tray didn't bring opportunity, it brought death at different times. This all teaches us a lesson about how systems of power and exploitation are formed, and how they become a dark reality in human history. When humans own other humans, horror follows. When traditions justify cruelty, cruelty becomes tradition. When economic interests outweigh human rights, humans lose. This is the warning that history gives us. Human trafficking still generates $150 billion annually. 15 million women are victims of forced marriages. And honor killings take 5,000 lives every year. Methods have changed, but the mentality remains the same. Some people still treat others as property and use religion and tradition to justify cruelty. It's important to remember that when we romanticize the past, we strengthen the present. Every Ottoman romance novel whitewashes systematic rape, and every historical drama erases real suffering. Remembering is important because forgetting allows history to repeat itself. Every evening when the sun set over Istanbul, a brutal ritual began turning the palace into a gambling den where women's lives were at risk. Imagine 400 women aged between 13 and 25 sitting in the most luxurious prison ever built, waiting to see if tonight they would be chosen for something that could either elevate them to power or send them to their death. The process was disturbingly simple but terrifying to think about. A silver tray was prepared in the Sultan's private room. On it were small pieces of paper, each with a woman's name written on it. The Sultan himself did not make the selection. He didn't want to take personal responsibility. Instead, eunuchs would make the selection and set it up like a lottery where winning could mean losing your life. Imagine your name being drawn from a hat, and instead of winning a prize, you might lose your life. The most upsetting part was that the women had to appear grateful. If they showed any hesitation, fear, or physical imperfection, there would be immediate consequences. You don't learn this in your history classes, but for these women, their own biology was their biggest fear. This scene is based on palace records from a typical selection night in 1640. The chief black eunuch, a man named Sunbul R, would enter the harem quarters exactly at 8 p.m. The women would be lined up in the golden hall like products on display. The silver tray would be carried through the palace corridors by 2 junior eunuchs while guards cleared the path. The journey from the Sultan's room to the harem would take exactly 12 minutes. On November 15, 1640, a woman named I was selected. The records show she was 17 years old and came from Serasia and had been in the harem for 3 years. When the eunuchs went to collect her, they discovered she was on her period. The Ottoman Empire wants you to forget this part. She never reached mourning. The official record lists her death as sudden illness, but the truth is different. It was a biological process she had no control over, and for that, she faced immediate punishment. But this selection process was just the beginning of the suffering, and the documents reveal even darker truths. If a woman was chosen and deemed suitable, she would be taken to the preparation chambers. There, 12 trained eunuchs would examine her. They would ask one question that determined her fate. Should her reproductive organs be preserved? This wasn't a soft question. It was a medical evaluation to decide if the woman had the right to keep her ability to have children. If the answer was no, a procedure would be arranged. If the answer was yes, she would be taken to the Sultan's chambers, knowing that if she failed to conceive within a specific time, she would face the same question again. The numbers tell a sad story. Out of 400 women in the harem at any given time, only 10 would ever have children. Only 10. The rest lived in a constant state of waiting, knowing that being forgotten was perhaps the best outcome. This is the truth not taught in history books. If a woman was repeatedly chosen but failed to produce an heir, she was seen as a burden. On March 3, 1652, palace records show that 23 women were relocated in one night. All of them had been chosen multiple times but had failed to conceive. The official records called it reassignment, but witnesses tell a different story. One account speaks of the dark waters of the Bosphorus. It gets worse. The psychological torment of the selection process was intentional. Dr. Fatma Göçek, a modern Ottoman historian, found documents showing that this randomness was carefully planned. They wanted women to feel just enough hope to avoid complete despair, but not enough to feel safe. It was psychological warfare, perfected over centuries. The selection process also served another purpose that few realize. It created competition among the women. Instead of uniting against their oppressors, they fought each other. Women would sabotage each other, report on each other's biological schedules, and celebrate when someone else was relocated. The system turned victims into accomplices. One French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, wrote in 1675, "The women of the seraglio are so fearful of the silver tray that many resort to drinking potions that damage their ability to have children, preferring that to the uncertainty of being selected." Think about that. Women were permanently harming their bodies to avoid the chance of being chosen. This is the truth that history books hide, and it reveals the dark economics behind this horrific system. Each woman in the harem was considered a major investment. They were bought, trained, clothed, and fed. The Ottoman Empire spent a large amount of money every year just on their care. However, this was considered justified because the system served many purposes. It was used to maintain pure bloodlines, prevent political alliances through marriage, and keep complete control over succession. The religious justification for this made it even more disturbing. Islamic law was manipulated to support this system. Natural biological functions were declared impure, not by religious texts, but by palace administrators who needed excuses for disposal. According to the state, any woman who became pregnant without the Sultan's permission was considered to have stolen from the state, as if women's bodies were state property. Modern historians are still trying to fully understand how this system worked. Digital analysis of palace records has revealed patterns that observers at the time missed. The selection process was not truly random. Women from certain regions were chosen more often. Women between the ages of 16 and 18 were preferred, and those who showed signs of intelligence or education were deliberately ignored. Now, let's talk about a 15-year-old girl who not only survived this cruel system, but took control of it and used it to her advantage. Her name was Alexandra Lisowska, but history remembers her as Roxelana, or Harem Sultan. Alexandra didn't just accept this system, she adapted to it, outsmarted it, and used it to achieve her own goals. In 1520, in a Ukrainian village, a 15-year-old girl was helping her father, an Orthodox priest, prepare for Sunday service. While picking wildflowers in the fields, Crimean Tatar raiders appeared. In just a few hours, her life was destroyed. Her family was killed, the village burned, and she was taken with other girls to be sold in the slave markets of Istanbul. At 15, after being torn away from her family, Alexandra decided her only option was to use the system to her advantage. When she arrived at the palace, she quickly learned that crying was a sign of weakness, and weakness meant death. So, she created the persona of Roxelana, a perfect character that eventually made her forget who Alexandra had been. In just 6 months, she learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. She didn't just learn the basics. She became fluent in these languages. She practiced so hard that her mouth would bleed, repeating phrases over and over until her accent disappeared. She realized that language wasn't just a tool for communication, but also a way to blend in. What was most surprising was how she used Sultan Suleiman to her advantage. She studied his routines, preferences, and moods. When he liked poetry, she became a poet. When he showed interest in politics, she developed opinions that matched his. She didn't just imitate him, she became his intellectual match. Not all women met violent ends. Sometimes the most cruel death was the one that wasn't death at all. Being exiled to the old palace, Eski Saray, was a psychological execution. Women who had aged or committed minor mistakes were sent to this decaying building on the outskirts of Istanbul. No visitors, no letters, no hope, just hundreds of abandoned women waiting for death. In 1670, a French diplomat described it as a living tomb. Women who entered as young adults came out like corpses, if they came out at all. The silence there was so complete you could almost hear hearts breaking. The women created their own sign language because speaking was discouraged. They developed an entire culture of the condemned. The costs of executions were carefully calculated. Silk strangulation cost 3 aksa, the price of a good meal. Drowning cost 20 aksa, including boat rental and crew wages. Banishment had no cost except the one-time transportation fee. The empire kept detailed records of execution expenses. Murder had its own budget line. What most people don't know is that the guards who carried out these executions were not monsters. They were ordinary palace employees with families and children. Many developed severe mental issues. Palace medical records from the 1600s show that executioners had the highest rates of depression and night terrors among the palace staff. In 1987, a strangler's journal was discovered that contained 400 pages of apologies to his victims. Every execution was documented in triplicate. Date, time, method, reason, and disturbing details like a satisfaction rating from supervising officials. They literally had customer service standards for murder. The most disturbing method was for women who attempted to escape. They were subjected to tash suzu, the stone punishment. Not stoning, as you might think, but instead, they were sealed alive inside the palace walls. In 2010, during renovations of Topkapi Palace, archaeologists discovered human remains inside the walls, confirming what had long been suspected. These women were literally erased from existence, becoming part of the palace structure. This method makes medieval European executions seem more humane, doesn't it? At least those were public spectacles with some twisted sense of justice. Here, these were private disappearances, industrial-scale killings with no traces left, no stories, no warnings, just empty beds waiting for new arrivals. The most complex and disturbing aspect of this system was the poison protocols. For high-ranking women, those who had borne children or held important positions, strangulation was considered too degrading. Instead, they were given special sherbet, which tasted like almonds and worked within hours. The palace had a chief poisoner who maintained a garden of toxic plants and tested new formulas on condemned criminals. But the palace didn't just consume women. It devoured children too. If you thought the women's suffering was bad, you haven't heard about the devshirme, the child collection system, which would make modern human trafficking look mild. While modern traffickers try to hide their crimes, the Ottomans made it official state policy. If you think the women had it bad, wait until you hear what happened to 12-year-old boys. The Ottoman Empire didn't wait for slaves to come to them. They had a child collection system so efficient that Amazon would be jealous. It was called the devshirme, which literally means collection or gathering. It seemed innocent, like they were collecting taxes or tributes, except the tribute was children and the tax was paid in human lives. Every 3 to 7 years, Ottoman officials would go into their Christian territories: Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Albania. Their mission was to shop for boys like they were livestock. I'm not joking. They had specifications, height requirements, dental exams, intelligence tests. The Ottoman Empire had quality control standards for child abduction. Imagine government officials coming to evaluate your son like livestock. The scene would unfold the same in every village. Ottoman soldiers would surround the settlement at dawn. The devshirme officer would set up in the town square. All Christian boys between the ages of 8 and 18 were required to present themselves. Muslim boys were exempt, creating a perverse incentive for families to convert, though conversion was often forbidden too. The selection process was thorough and terrifying. Boys were stripped naked in public, checked for physical defects, tested for intelligence and strength. The officer would check their teeth like he was buying horses, measure their height, evaluate their muscle tone. Parents watched their children being assessed like cattle, knowing that selection meant never seeing them again. Here's what the textbooks don't mention: the quotas. Each region had to provide a specific number of boys based on population. If they couldn't find enough suitable candidates, the standards would be lowered. In bad years, they'd take boys as young as 6 or as old as 20. The only absolute requirement, they had to be Christian. The empire needed children with no connection to Islamic law that might protect them. The Ottoman Empire collected about 200,000 Christian boys, which is about 1,000 boys per year. This went on every year for 2 centuries. Here's the simple English version of the text you provided. In the Ottoman Empire's palace, detailed records were kept of the treatment of children and women. The palace doctors recorded injuries and illnesses. Looking closely at these records, it becomes clear that abuse was systematic. Many boys suffered from anal tears, throat infections, and mental stress. Suicides were common but were hidden. It was said that these boys died of illness or accidents. There was a tower in the palace where 31 boys died between 1640 and 1645. These boys didn't fall by accident. They jumped. However, their deaths were reported as accidents. The children were taught that their pain was a form of worship, and resisting it was seen as spiritual weakness. They were told that serving the senior officials would make them better Muslims. If any boy tried to escape, they were punished severely. Some were made to stand on cold marble for hours, or were locked away in isolation. When European diplomats witnessed this, they were shocked, but continued to take part in the system. In 1670, the Venetian ambassador wrote that what he saw at the palace school would be considered demonic in Christian lands, but his fellow countrymen saw it as entertainment. Boys who graduated from the palace school were divided into 3 groups. Some became highly loyal and rose to become ministers, military commanders, or governors. Others were physically altered to work in the harem. The rest were quietly removed when they became too damaged to be of use. This system created some of the most effective administrators in the Ottoman Empire. These men shared a strong bond because of the pain and trauma they endured. They protected each other and the system that had created them. In 1701, a survivor wrote about their experience. They said that their name, faith, and innocence were taken from them. In return, they were given knowledge and power, but remained haunted by fear and pain. This system was officially closed in 1909, but its effects are still felt today. The palace building is now part of the Topkapi Palace Museum, where tourists walk through the halls where children were broken, but no one mentions the suffering behind it. The Ottoman records also mention women who entered the harem but later disappeared. Out of 400 women, only 3 survived into old age. The rest either died or disappeared. This shows the cruelty of a system that valued human life so little. These records show that the system was designed to use people as mere tools. Lives were lost under the name of culture, beauty, and power. This continued until the Ottoman Empire attempted reforms in 1839. However, the system was so powerful that it fiercely resisted. Finally, in 1908, the empire fell, and the system was brought to an end. This history teaches us an important lesson. When cruelty becomes a tradition or system, humanity can get trapped in it. We need to remember this history so we can understand how injustice can take root in societies and how we must always stand against it.